All right. So what I'm going to talk about today, and I'm very pleased to see that I know a number of the people that are appearing. I've talked to some of you before, some face to face and some on the phone, because the pandemic's kind of changed where I can go these days. But oh, someone else is just trying to come in too. So I don't know if I can do that or if
I
you
got
have
it.
to do that. Okay. Um, the more the merrier, I say. Uh, so I'm going to be talking about, if I ever get a chance to get to this, because it's not playing nice with me right now. I'm going to be talking about the new retention schedule for everybody. It's called the LGS 1, Local Government Schedule 1, because we're New York State. We are not exactly incredibly creative, but we do get the point across. So I'm going to talk about how you can work with the retention schedule as far as local historians. Okay, so oh, there we go. First thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to understand the retention schedule, what exactly this retention schedule is, how to navigate it if you are not familiar with it. Maybe you have those big old binders, you know, as Jason was showing, you have the telephone book of a binder, or we have some online versions as well. There's a PDF version and an online version that you can search, and I'm going to show you exactly, kind of give a quick demonstration of that. And then what exactly is this LGS1? You know, if you were familiar with the MU1 or maybe the CO2, what happened to those? Talk about that as well. Specific things about some town historians records and what we can do with those. And then like Matthew said, a quick Q&A at the end. And if you have questions as we're going through, you're welcome to ask as well, because I'm fairly informal, so you don't have to worry. Okay, so what exactly is a retention schedule if you're not familiar? Well, we have a unit in the state archives called a retention schedule unit, and that's all that they do. They focus entirely on the development of these schedules. And what that means is they go through and look at laws, regulations, statutes, everything related to records and how long they need to be kept.
Michael, we're just seeing you right now, not your PowerPoint.
Oh, okay.
I can see the PowerPoint.
Oh, you can? Well,
I
okay, that's
can.
just me then.
I
All right,
can
go
also
Okay.
for
see
it.
the PowerPoint.
Oh,
Okay.
you can?
You're special.
All right.
All right, go for it. It's just me then.
So it says I'm sharing the screen.
It says I'm viewing your screen. It just showing me. Let's see if I got a different option. Keep going. I'll figure it out.
Okay, well, how many people can see and how many can't? More than not? All right, so it looks like most can.
Okay.
So I'm gonna then I'll keep plowing along then. Um, going back here. All right, so the unit in Albany that develops these schedules, they are the experts at this. They know all the laws, they know all the regulations, and they understand why these records are created in the first place and how long you need to keep them. And the whole purpose of the retention schedule is it lists the legal minimum retention periods. So it tells you what is the least amount of time you need to keep something. Now, I know you're historians, and the idea of getting rid of anything is the worst thing in the world, and I totally understand that, because why would you want to get rid of anything? But what we're talking about is records that are typically created on, you know, a daily basis, and they start taking up a lot of room. So what is the time period that after 6 years or maybe after 10 years, you can get rid of them legally and not have any issues? So that's what the whole idea of the retention schedule is what's the legal minimum amount of time you need to keep specific records. So it kind of runs the gamut. There's a number of records that are determined to be permanent or archival records, and I'll talk about some examples of those, which obviously you would be mostly interested in. But you know, there's also your general fiscal records, which you can get rid of after 6 years, which is a nice window for an audit, that sort of thing. Just to let you know that the reason behind it is there are laws and regulations behind it. Every time that you see a number come up in terms of a retention schedule for how long you need to keep something, there is a logical reason behind it. The other thing is these schedules are what we call media neutral. Means doesn't matter whether it's paper, electronic, microfilm, maybe an old map, whatever it may be. it's all media neutral. So it doesn't matter what format it is, you keep it the same amount of time. So in the case of correspondence, it doesn't matter whether it's a typewritten letter from 1922 or an email from 2012, they still have the same retention period, that sort of thing. So just to give you a basic idea. There are some things, though, that our schedule does not do. It doesn't tell you that you have to destroy things. It doesn't tell you you have to get rid of things. It just tells you what the legal minimum time period that you can keep them. It doesn't address all records management issues. So even though it is about the size of a phone book, when people still remember what phone books are, but it doesn't address everything. It won't help you identify what confidential records are or personal information. It doesn't explain to how to handle non-records. And this is something that you're actually, as town historians, are probably pretty interested in, because that's in terms of your publications. And publications, in most cases, unless you are collecting them to talk about the history of the town, you do not need to keep. So the person who's coming to you and says, I have an old book, are you interested in it? You don't have to keep that. You only have to keep things that are specific to your town and your local area, for example. And then it also doesn't tell you how to destroy the actual records, meaning how to get rid of them, making sure you're shredding confidential information, that sort of thing. Okay. So why use a schedule in the first place? Well, it makes sure that you're keeping your records for as long as you actually need to. I'll admit this person, what the heck. And you're discarding the records that you no longer need. Now here's where it comes in, because, excuse me, part of the deal is the clerk is always looking to get rid of stuff, right? Your town clerk, your county clerks, whoever, they're always looking to get rid of stuff because they're looking for space. That's almost always the case, particularly if something's older and they don't necessarily need it anymore according to the retention schedule. So what they're supposed to do in conjunction with you is there's a number of different examples within the retention schedule where it says appraise for historical value. And they're supposed to work with you to get an idea of, well, are these important or not? Because some of these records, even though they've met their retention period, there still may be historical interest in those. And those can then be passed on to you so you can work with those. Let's see. You can also, so discard records no longer needed. You can improve records retrieval, because if you're getting rid of things that you no longer need, then in theory, it's a lot easier to get to things. Obviously, you're going to save space if you're getting rid of things on a regular basis. And you're also going to be saving money as well, because you're not wasting it storing things that you don't need. Helps you identify those permanent records. So the clerk, the town historian, you've identified those records you need to keep forever. They're archival records, they're the important ones. They last. And in theory, it's going to make everybody's work easier because you're getting rid of things you no longer need and you identify what you need to keep. And that's what the whole schedule, that's really what the schedule does. Okay, so navigating the retention schedule. What are we talking about here? Well, first and foremost is you have to identify what we call the record series. And if you're familiar with the schedule, you'll know that the record series themselves don't always use what I would call normal language. They don't use natural language because these are based on statutes, regulations, and laws. They often use kind of a stilted, almost legalese version of things. So you have to be familiar with that. And if you're not, then that's where you ask myself or somebody else to help you identify what the record series is. Because sometimes it's pretty straightforward. You can tell what somebody's letter is. You can tell, this is a tax roll. You can tell that sort of thing. Other times you find things, you're like, well, where exactly does this fall? We can help you with that. And then you determine the official copy. You only need to keep one copy of everything according to the retention. So once you determine that official copy, that's the one that's kept. Everything else is considered a convenience copy, and you can get rid of it when you're no longer needed. So all those copies of annual reports, you only need to keep one, for example. You want to check the schedule's functional headings, and I'll show an example of that, but that's basically, you know, your basic departments and different functions within the local government that it's going to be under. So we're talking fiscal, public safety, public health, that sort of thing. Administration, you know, that's where your minutes would be, that sort of thing. There's an index to the schedule for the paper copy and the PDF online version, so you can always check that. But if you're using the electronic versions, it's a lot easier just to search the keywords, and I'll give an example of that in a moment. And then, of course, if you can't find anything, you're not 100% sure, you contact me. If I don't know, I'll talk to the people in Albany who are the experts, and they'll give me an answer. We're dealing a lot of questions right now with what to do with all these COVID records that are being created, for example, and that's been a longer discussion as well, because while the schedule was put together over the last 6 to 8 years, we had dealt with pandemic record, or what we would call public health incidents, but it didn't necessarily mean, you know, everything was covered in terms of that. So we're still tweaking things as we go because it's a never-ending process. Okay, so specific to the LGS1, what the LGS1 is, it's combined all the 4 different schedules. So if you are familiar with the ED1 for school districts, the MU1 for municipalities, towns and villages, CO2 for the counties, or the MI1 for libraries, fire districts, we used to call them miscellaneous governments, all of those were consolidated into one thing, which is why it's over 400 pages. And what it did is we eliminated any kind of, hello, Pamela. We eliminated any kind of duplication there. So we got rid of any kind of duplication in the schedules because there was so much between the different schedules. So all of that is gone. We named it the LGS1. Like I said, it took about 6 to 8 years of a whole bunch of people working on it, checking the old ones. If you had a copy of the MU1, I don't think that was updated since 2003. I want to say the CO2 was more recent. That might have been like 2008 or 2010, but most of these had not been updated since 2003. So we were desperately needed of some kind of update. If you were familiar with specific items in the schedule, the item numbers have changed, but if you were familiar with them, there's a couple of different ways to find the old numbers and how they match up with the new ones. We retained the same section headings with very few. I think the only difference was there was a miscellaneous one that's now called general administration, and there was one like data electronic processing or electronic something like that. It was really old and clunky, and now it's just called information technology section, which people are much more familiar with. The other thing is we flagged any major revisions and any new items, and here's the big thing, it has to be adopted by January 1st. And the reason why is if your town or village or county does not adopt it by January 1st, the other ones won't exist anymore. So you can't have the you can't follow the MU1 or anything else. And those clerks are not going to be allowed legally to get rid of anything according to those old schedules. So most towns and villages are furiously making sure that they adopt them before the January 1st deadline. Any questions before I talk about specifics within the schedule a little bit?
Yes.
Just really quick.
Go ahead.
Okay, yep.
Go ahead, Jason.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kate. Question is, right now, one of the villages that falls within my overview and everything, Jordan, does not have a historian. And I'm hoping to be able to meet with them very soon to discuss like the, if they're in the process of adopting the LGS01, how does a village have to go through the process? Is it just a question of getting the manual and then beginning to follow its guidelines, or is there a motion or something that has to be done?
There has to be some kind of resolution passed by a board or some kind of, overseeing entity. Usually it's the town board or some part of the county, and they have a resolution to adopt the new schedule. You don't have to notify us that that whether or not you've adopted it, but
Mhm.
most people, we've been putting the message out that you cannot get rid of anything after January 1st. So most are furiously trying to do that, as I mentioned. However, if you want a sample resolution, make sure I have your contact information, and I can send that along, because we actually have a sample resolution because so many people have asked for it. It's real simple. It's just a couple of sentences, and you can just put in your thing too, saying, here, we've adopted it by law, everything's all set, that sort of thing.
Thank you, Michael. I should have your email contact from when we were discussing and things earlier, so I'll send you an email for that.
Okay, sounds good. But if anybody else wants a copy, just include it in the chat, and I'll make sure I get that as well. Okay?
Just really quick, Mike.
Sure.
Now, when you talked about the functional heading changes,
Yes.
with the MU1, I was trying to help the fire department also, and
Mhm.
some of what we had seemed to contradict. Like there is some stuff that crossed.
MU1,
was
the fire, are you talking about the fire district or the fire department?
the fire district.
Okay, the fire district would have a different schedule. That would be the MI1.
Okay, the MI one.
Yes.
Okay,
So there
because
might be slight differences there.
our fire department is the same district.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's the town of Cisco, dude. You've been here.
Yeah, oh, yeah. Everybody's got those stories. So
So
here's the fun part. You
So
don't,
does this remove the overlapping, I guess I want to say?
yes, all the
Okay.
overlapping is gone. The LGS1 is is the one to rule them all. It's the one that matters at this point. Everybody will follow the LGS1 once it's been adopted. So there's no more confusion about, well, should I be MU1 or MI1 or anything else? That doesn't matter. It's all the LGS1 now.
And because you know her, I have to ask, she said she called recently, the court clerk,
Yes.
Georgette,
Yes.
has started to pillage the back room.
Okay.
She said that she had talked to you recently. What about her court records? Because some of that is historic in nature.
The
But
court
is
records.
that because her court records may be something different than this?
Court records do not use the LGS1. Yes.
Okay.
The court records have a completely different schedule that's put out by the Office of Court Administration.
Okay.
And I actually explained that to her.
Yeah, we agreed
and-
on her only touching supervisor stuff for now, so.
Okay. All right. That's good. Yeah, they have a schedule that's similar to ours, but it's not 100% the same, because there's different things that have to be done in terms of when you can get rid of records and who can authorize them being getting rid of. A
Okay.
lot of court records, you sometimes have to check with other judicial entities, that sort of thing. DA records, for example, for a county, you cannot get rid of them. I just was dealing with this recently, as Justin could attest to in Oswego. You can't get rid of them until after 25 years. And even if you want to get rid of them and it's been 25 years, they have to go through this process through the Court of Appeals, that they have to review them as well. So nothing is particularly simple with court records, but that is by design.
Okay.
And the
perfect.
retention schedule tells you which ones you need to keep permanently, so you don't necessarily have to worry about whether you're getting rid of something that you shouldn't.
Okay.
Because I know
All
that's
right.
a question that everybody else has too. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, let's see if we can get this back here. All right. I can do a quick demo. Let me see if it'll let me share the next part. Yep, new share. And I want to share, where'd it go? There we go, my local government schedule. Okay, so if you go to our wonderful website, which is archives.nised.gov, and you go to our managing records section, retention and disposition schedules. You also see we got a whole new section on documenting COVID-19 records too, because so many people have been asking. And then you drop down a little bit and you'll see LGS1. And this is where we got a couple of really kind of interesting things. One, you can download the PDF version right here. As you can see, it's officially 411 pages. But we also have a database and a spreadsheet with all the different fields that talk about those different subject headings, as well as all the items, and a crosswalk if you happen to know what the MU1 number was, how you can go back and forth. I was talking about those subject headings and the functional headings. Here they are along the side here. You can see, won't even let me highlight. Okay. So that, as you kind of walking through, and one thing that's nice is they have a nice search the schedule function. And we've even included some search tips, because remember I talked about that issue about legal versus common terms, technical features, and so on. Okay, so let's just do historian, and we'll apply, and we'll see what comes up. Okay, so then we see local historian records. It also identifies what the previous schedule items were, and not surprisingly, permanent. Permanent is what we're talking about for retention. The only thing that are not is things that do not, that you basically only keep for reference purposes. So you can get rid of those after no longer needed. And ones that are covered by published materials are not considered to be public records. So those family histories or something else that people may have, those are not necessarily considered public records, for example. So that's just a basic idea of the schedule and what it does. But as you're kind of going through, we can look at the county clerk, for example. You can drop down, see that little diamond there. That means it's new or it's had some kind of major revision. These local government lien records, it's now 6 years after discharge or 20 years, whichever is shorter. These used to be permanent, for example. So they determined that they can start to get rid of some of those, for example. Okay, so let me see if it will let me easily go back, because that would be nice. Okay. So when we're talking about the historical records that you're dealing with on a regular basis, what we're talking about is, are these archival or historical records? And I'll give some examples in a little bit. Question about, how does the town clerk, or how do you as the town historian identify them? And then the big question is, will this retention schedule even help? When we're talking about historical or archival records, those are the ones with the ongoing administrative, legal, physical, or research value. And the research value is where a town historian really comes in, or county historian, because there's a lot of different things that talk about the historical appraisal, appraise for historical value. And that's where you come in to determine what exactly is the long-term implication in terms of research. So let's say you could get rid of, election records from 2020 in 15 years. You probably don't want to, because this seems like an election that people would be really interested in coming in the next 15, 20, 50 years or so. Just be like getting rid of elections from 1968 or 72. Probably people want to keep those around. And that's what you can help determine those. Or maybe there's a specific incident in the town where the financial issue became a really big thing. Yes, you can get rid of those financial records after 6 years, but maybe it's when the highway first came in, or maybe it's when, a new public park or something else that was pretty major that you think people will have long-term interest in. That's where the historical appraisal aspect can come in. And then, of course, that long-term usefulness for historical or other research. And then we make it very plain, there are some records that are permanent in the retention schedules. We say that when it gets to the part where it says retention period, clearly says permanent. You cannot get rid of those. So when we're talking about a retention period and keeping it for the entire retention period, we're talking about permanent records here. So here I have some examples of historical records. Obvious ones like minutes, annual reports, architectural drawings, tax rolls, correspondence. These pre-1910 records. Okay, the whole thing with pre-1910 records is the clerk or anybody cannot get rid of anything prior to 1910. And there's very specific reason for that. People who are familiar with New York State history will probably know. There was a fire in the state capitol in 1911, which destroyed a lot of records, particularly from the Revolutionary War era and some other time periods. So anything prior to 1910, we say you cannot get rid of because we may not have a copy of that ourselves. So we want to determine that first. Formats, we're talking paper, microfilm, photographs, but we're also going into electronic records as well, because just because something's new doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have a permanent retention. That's where we're getting into videotapes, email, websites, and so on. So this overall appraisal process, we're talking about conducting some kind of inventory or survey for the records that you have. And these can be just the records within, within your area as a town historian. You want to have a pretty good idea of what you have in the first place. Many of these records probably had some kind of survey done within the last 20 years or so. If that paper copy exists, you want to make sure you can track it down in some way, because somebody should know what should be there one way or the other. You want to use the appropriate New York State retention schedule. In this case, there's only one, so we know we're using the LGS 1. You want to appraise these records for local and broader significance. So again, we're talking about that historical aspect for the records, not just keeping them for their legal reasons and for fiscal reasons to make sure that nobody gets in trouble legally, but that long-term research value. You want to figure out the uniqueness of the information that's included. Maybe you have record of something that nobody else has. You want to make sure that that information is kept. And then when we're talking about intrinsic value, we got a whole list of publications here about how to help determine that. So if you're looking for inventory and planning, we have a publication on that. We have a publication just about the intrinsic value of local government records. I can make those available to you and show you where you can find them online as well. And so we do not leave you in the dark. That's the whole idea. We try to help you as much as possible. So if the publications don't necessarily make sense and you want to ask me questions, you are always more than welcome to do so. That's what I'm here, is to help explain what needs to be done in terms of records. So it doesn't matter whether you're talking about preserving, a floppy disk, or a vellum map, or whatever you may have to deal with. I can help you with that, or at least find somebody else who can. We're talking about, just identifying some of these records and maybe appraising them. You want to start small and then build up. So identify your priorities, identify what are your most important records. And, do they need some conservation or preservation? Are they organized? Do you even know what you have? And then you kind of set goals about what you're interested in doing. If you want to first preserve these so you can make sure that people can have access to these, that sort of thing is the long-term discussion you have to have. It's great to have these records for research, but what good is it if you don't have people using them, or people don't have an opportunity to use the records that you have? That sort of thing is a long-term goal you can discuss. If you're interested in a basic assessment, you can always talk to me. I'm happy. Well, I'm not visiting as much anymore right now, but I'm happy to chat, do video chats, to talk on the phone. I've actually found out that, people have questions. It's not as easy as you would think to have someone describe something, but if they show me a picture or something else, with your phone or whatever else you may have, we can usually figure out what you're working with. A lot of people are dealing with situations where their storage area is not the best. And just saying it's not the best is not the same as, seeing a picture of the basement that things are stored in, or the attic or something else. So getting those pictures back and forth, even if I can't visit, is always important. You want to talk with other local governments like you're doing here at these kind of meetings, sharing information back and forth, maybe some horror stories, maybe some success, whatever it may be, so people get an idea that you're not the only one trying to deal with this. Receive additional training. We have, like I said, the publications. We also have webinars available as well. Those are, basically just on our YouTube channel, so you can get a basic idea of what we're talking about in terms of records management. And then seek grants. Yes, we do have grants. As far as I know, those grants are going to be available after the first of the year, fingers crossed. But we've been told that everything is supposed to be normal. So we are preparing right now our training for filling out grant applications. And in our grant applications, there's a whole category for historical records projects, whether you want to make sure that you're sharing the information or you want to put it on a website, maybe set up a exhibit or do some kind of conservation, we can help with all that. So if you're interested in a grant, again, you can contact me and we can get that information across as well. And here's our list of resources, our publications, there's our fancy dancy website where you can find everything. And again, if you start going in the website, you can't find exactly what I was talking about, I can help walk you through that as well or give you specific links to things. And then we have a Historical Records Advisory Board for the whole state. They have an example right here for a self-assessment for your archives and your records in general. And then there's, used to be just DHP, now it's DIPSNY for the state of New York, Documentary Heritage Program, and they can provide education and training as well. And if you don't know, they do a lot of online training as well, and they're more specific to documenting cultural heritage institutions, so your museums and historical societies they work with a lot. So they have a lot of information in terms of conservation and preservation. And I think I'm at the point where we can take some more questions if people would like, and I don't have to share my screen anymore. But there is my contact information, and I'll share that in the chat as well. So I appreciate you listening to me, and let me know if you have any more questions.
Michael, can you kind of go over one of the things that we have found? I don't know how many people realize the wide swath of records. I don't know if that's the right phrasing to put it, but for example, one of the things we asked you was about, we didn't know about body cameras for our police department and the policies
Yes.
on those. And some of you may have villages that have body cams or dash cams. So talk a little bit about the records that organizations, governments may not be aware of that are even part of this, because there is a lot of new stuff.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how often town historians are going to run into it, but certainly there's a lot of different things that have been added. Things that didn't exist in 2003, like, as you mentioned, body cams, the red light cameras that take your picture and make sure that you'll get your ticket, whether a police officer is there or not. Those kind of things didn't exist really then. They've all been included. Any kind of changes in the law, for example, the Child Victims Act, that changed the retention for all sexual abuse records, because previously they were only up to a certain period of time. Civil cases now can be brought forth 55 years after the act, so that changed the retention for those. We had started the public health incident records, and that ended up, changing into what we would record for the pandemic and the COVID and the coronavirus. So we are still changing. We are making changes, but in terms of the wide swath, there is everything that a local government does as a daily course of business can be considered a record. And they all have different retention periods. So it doesn't necessarily mean it all has to be kept forever, but it all has to be kept for a certain period of time. And they all should be identified in one way or another in that retention schedule. So as I was trying to say, it doesn't matter whether it's microfilm, email, maybe somebody's old floppy disk or a CD, or, you know, a typewritten letter. It's all kind of covered within that schedule. And there's going to be records from all the different departments that you may not even deal with that often. I know, you know, when you're talking about the fire department or the police department, they don't always necessarily want to share their records um, with the with the clerks and everything else. And I know that that's a long-standing issue as well. But they all have to be identified and make sure that they're following the retention schedule. So there is a incredible amount of records that can be covered under that LGS1 schedule. I hope that helps.
If you got questions, ask him now. Otherwise, Michael's a very busy man.
I actually have a question, if I may.
Sure, Jason.
Elbridge, we have a bit of a unique situation. We talked about this a bit already, about how not only do we have the clerical records and everything being kept, but we then have a separate archival room with historical records as well as a number of artifacts. And my background was with museums and such, and one thing that I'm looking into doing and working with Jan on and such is to put together an index of what we have in the archives and the artifacts and things, including accession numbers. With the records themselves, is there any procedure for numbering them and everything that comes from the schedule here and everything, or once we have it and it's no longer being retained by the schedule and everything, do we give it a separate accession number for being in an independent, if you will?
What we recommend is when you're organizing and labeling your records, is we recommend you use the schedule to help label those records. So in the case of, you know, correspondence, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but you put correspondence, the years that it covers, right? And then you include whatever that schedule item is, and you put that right on the box, whatever kind of label it has. And then you include the retention period, which in 90% of your cases, since you're town historians, is going to be permanent.
Right.
And
Okay,
you make that very clear.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense because we've got a mix and everything. We've got records that are definitely permanent and everything, and then we have a number of records that have been deaccessioned but retained for their historical purposes. And while I know that some of the historical records fall under permanent no matter what, there is the case of the ephemera given to us outside of government resources which have no retention period.
Right. And that's where you're getting into your publications and other things, which you can keep for reference purposes and other things, but you don't necessarily have to keep according to that retention schedule. Yep. And you also run into that whole issue of historical appraisal as well.
Right. Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
Last call for questions.
Yeah, I don't want to take up all your time.
Well, if no one else has another one, I do have one other, if I may. I don't want to hog things up here. But we had talked about looking into scheduling and setting up an inventory survey and everything for the town of Elbridge. And having looked over the publication 76 about inventorying and planning that and everything, would it cover the various sites that they are at? But because where the archives are is in a different location than where the clerk offices and their records are kept.
If you're doing an inventory, you want to make sure that everything is being included, because you may not know where all the records are being stored. You may not know what is in that attic, what is in that highway garage, what is in, you know, that DPW barn attic. You have no idea what exactly it is until you identify them. And until a complete inventory is done, you don't know what you're dealing with. So nothing has been labeled. You don't know what you can get rid of. You don't know what you need to keep until that's done. You also don't know what condition things are in, because quite often, as we all know, the records that are kept for the longest time get moved to the side. And
Mhm.
while the really important ones may be stored in a safe or a file cabinet somewhere, you know, people know that the early vital records, your birth, death, and marriage, you know, all those handwritten or early volumes or the early minutes, those are probably kept someplace safe. But something from 1922, maybe not. So you have to be able to go find out where the records are, see what kind of condition they are in, and then work from there. And the only way you can do that is do an inventory of everything that you have. That includes all locations.
And from what I understand, the grants and funds and everything help go towards a third party that assists in that process.
That is correct. There are specialists throughout the area, you know, throughout the state who specialize in coming in, identifying your records, telling you what you need to keep, what you can get rid of, and then finally writing up some policies and procedures about how you can make sure that the kind of records mess that you're in doesn't happen again.
Hmm. Thank you.
No problem.
Michael,
Yes.
Rosa here. Are historical societies bound by this new retention schedule?
Historical societies are not if they're not a part of the local government.
Okay,
Um,
they have their own,
they do not have to follow any retention schedule legally because they're, you know, most historical societies are nonprofit.
okay,
They're going
Uh,
to have whatever in their bylaws.
Right.
that
They're
should
going to
be
have to
written
follow
up.
their bylaws. And, oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that should be written up in whatever your charter or your organization papers are, should clearly state how you guys plan to retain your accession policies, your deaccession policies, stuff like that.
gotcha, okay.
What your collection policy is, why you have the things you have, and what you can get rid of, and when you can't.
Okay, thank you, you guys.
Yep. That's the Madison County Historical Society in my experience coming through.
Any other questions for Michael? Well, he put his contact information in the chat box, so you can get his email and his phone number there if you have more questions and you're shy. Michael, thank you for joining us today and doing this. We really appreciate it.
No problem.
And we'll let you get back to work or hiking in the mountains, wherever you are.
My kitchen table is always ready. So thank you for having me. And again, if you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks
All right,
again.
we will talk to you soon.
Thank you.